Hey guys, bachphotography here, and today we are looking at my lens collection, or at least part of my lens collection. We're going to do this over 2 videos, so make sure you hit that subscribe button and press the notification bell so you don't miss out on part 2 of this video. And there'll be links to all of these lenses in the description if you're interested in checking them out as well. And we're just going to be looking at all the different lenses I have in my camera bag when I go on photo shoots, and for each particular lens, what I like about it, what I use it for, what I don't like about it, and whether or not it's a good lens for your sort of photography and what you want to do in your photography journey. So the first lens here we're looking at is my Sigma 85mm f1.4, and this is probably my favorite lens for portraits, but I also use it for wedding photography. You can do even landscape photography on it as well, but it's definitely an awesome one for portraits. And the reason for that is it's got a really low aperture of f1.4, and as you can see there, the front element is huge, and that's so that you can have a super low aperture in your lens, and then you can take really beautiful blurry background photos and also really awesome photos in low light. So the reason this is a really good portrait lens is it's 85mm, which gives you a great focal distance to isolate your subject, and it also means that you get great compression in the background, particularly when you're shooting at low aperture, to really make a creamy, beautiful background too. And when you're shooting at low apertures with this lens, when you focus on a model's eyes, for example, in portraits, you can even start to make her skin, especially on her cheeks and on her neck, smoother than you would see it on her eyes and things like that. So it can really be flattering for a model to use that lens. So that's my 85mm 1.4. The next lens we're going to be looking at is a really strange one actually. It's called the Helios 44-2, and this is a vintage lens from the Soviet era. Mine's a 1980s, an early 1980s version, and this is a 40mm or 44mm f2. And the interesting thing about this lens is that it makes really unusual swirly bokeh that's sort of warped in the corners and makes like a really spirally beautiful effect. So this lens is M42 mount, which means that to get onto my Canon 5D Mark IV and on my Sony a7R II, I do need to actually adapt it with an M42 adapter, and that's what you can see in my other hand there. And this lens is a clickless aperture lens, which means that there's no clicks when you're changing the aperture, which means it's really great for videography, and it's a good portrait lens. It's a nice normal focal length, I think 40 or 44, 42mm, something like that. So good for portraits, good for general purpose photography, and it has a really interesting characteristic. So the next lens I have here is a Sigma 50mm f1.4 non-art lens, and this is the older version of the 50mm lens. They've come out with a new one which is the 50mm 1.4 art lens, but this one here is also really good, the non-art version, the DG HSM version, and they say that it's not as good and it's not very sharp, but I found that's actually incredibly sharp, especially in the middle, and you can get it for like $450 online instead of, you know, the $1,000 price tag that the new 50mm has. So it's a really great option, especially if you're on a budget. Now I've probably shot, I would say, about 200,000 photos on just this lens alone, so mine is pretty much dead now. The autofocus has stopped working. It works sometimes, but it's kind of temperamental and decides when or when it doesn't want to work. So I pretty much have stopped using this lens now, and I'm going to get the new version, which is the art lens version. But it's fantastic for portraits, great all-round lens, really good for landscapes as well. You can do pretty much anything you want on this. Definitely a must-have lens for wedding photographers and event photographers. So the next lens we're going to be looking at here is my Sigma 35mm 1.4 art lens, and this is a really fantastic lens. I really do like this one for weddings, especially when you're shooting in a smaller space for getting ready and things like that. It can be a really good portrait lens as well if you want to sort of show off a bit more of the background of where you're shooting. You've got to be careful with portraits with this lens because it can start to warp your subject if they're a little close, but still a really, really great lens. One thing I would say though is that the autofocus on this lens is really quite slow, considering it is quite a normal focal length. 35, it's not super wide. It shouldn't be that difficult to make a fast autofocus motor for this lens, and I really think that it is lacking in this particular point. So if you're doing something fast-paced, maybe don't get this lens, but it's incredibly sharp. If your subject isn't moving very much, definitely would recommend this lens. Really sharp, really easy to use, very robust. I think it has weather sealing as well. So yeah, a fantastic lens. I haven't used this one too much because it's quite new in my bag, but something I definitely will be using more in the future and definitely making some more videos on in the future as well. And 35mm is also a must-have in your camera bag. It's a very good focal length for pretty much any type of photography you want, very versatile lens. So if you're just looking at getting some new lenses and you don't have that many things, a 35mm is definitely something to consider. So this next lens is actually one of the first lenses I ever bought. It is a Sigma 10-20 f4 to 5.6. And I think they also have an f3.5 version of this lens too, but this was a cheaper version. And at the time, didn't have much money, wanted to get a wide angle, and this is the one I chose. Now, I believe this lens is actually for APS-C cameras, but it actually works really, really well with my Sony a7R II, and you don't see that much vignetting when you put it on that camera, strangely enough. And I think it's because the Sony a7R II is mirrorless, so the actual sensor is closer to the back element of the lens. So it's a really, really wide angle lens. It's good for landscapes. The corners of the photo will be quite warped because it is a sort of fisheye design, this lens, but it's a really fun lens to use. Definitely something for getting really dramatic images, just a bit of fun, something that you can get some really unusual images from too. So definitely would recommend a wide angle if you don't have one. The 10-22 is quite an extreme wide angle. You can go more extreme, but yeah, awesome fun. Maybe not the best for portraits and things like that, but definitely something a little bit different to have in your camera bag as well. And finally, the last lens I'll be showing you in this video is the lens that I actually filmed most of this video on, which is my Sigma 24mm f1.4 Art lens. Now this lens is really awesome too, and I got it personally for music photography. It's a really wide angle so you can get super dramatic portraits. It's quite a difficult lens to use for portraits because it really does warp the image when you use this lens because it is so wide. So if you're shooting your model close up, they might start looking a little bit strange just because the image is stretched because of the front element of this lens. But you can get some really dramatic images. It's super wide, so it's great for architecture. It's great really for a lot of things, but architecture would be one of the main ones, and also for portraits if you're really looking to capture a lot of the background in a photo. Now I really like this for music photography because I think for music photography the closer you can get to the musicians the better, because you can get a more emotional and dramatic image, and the wider you can go the better because you really get a better understanding of the surroundings in a photo when you can see more of the background. So that's why I think this lens is awesome. Kind of difficult to use in certain situations like in portrait photography, and it's quite expensive as well. It's quite a niche lens, I guess you could say, but definitely something to look into if you're looking for a really high quality wide angle lens. So this is what you'll see day to day in my camera bag when I go on shoots. Make sure you like and subscribe because I'll be releasing part 2 of this video in the near future, and thank you very much for watching.